Well, good morning. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I expect some more people will be dropping in on this webinar. I would like to welcome everybody to the second of a three-part series on strategic relationships and restructuring. We're really excited to have you all here today. I would like to thank our presenters, Doug Sauer, with assistance from Stephanie Mattoon, a local attorney from Bear Home, and one of the best nonprofit lawyers that I've worked with in town. I also want to give a special thanks to the Omaha Community Foundation for underwriting this series. As you heard, this webinar is being recorded. In today's conversation, we're going to focus on the nitty-gritty of successfully pursuing and implementing restructuring strategies, including but not limited to the process of identifying potential partners, negotiating and due diligence phases, and the legal processes involved and challenges of operational integration. There's so much involved as people navigate these situations. We're hearing more and more about this happening in our neck of the woods. And so that's one reason why we are offering this series again and recording it. If you did not make it to the first series, we recommend that you watch the YouTube recording on that. And we will share those to NAM, these recordings with NAM members. So let me introduce Doug Sauer. Doug Sauer is a nonprofit expert who has helped thousands of nonprofits of all missions and circumstances with their capacity building needs. Doug is the former CEO of the New York Council of Nonprofits, or NYCON, was there for more than 40 years and is a nationally recognized nonprofit leader. Doug has been recognized by the Nonprofit Times and one of the top 50 leaders of power and influence. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Doug.
Well, thank you, and welcome everybody. We'll look at the slide that we're covering today. Hopefully all of you either attended the last session or you've seen the recording of the last session. We don't want to repeat it verbatim, but we will kind of refer to it as we go ahead. In that session, we really focused on the environment and how it relates to any consideration around restructuring opportunities, how this, when you look at these relationships, what that word strategic means in terms of how strategic your organization is. Do you know where you're going next couple of years? And if you're looking at these opportunities, then how does that help you get to where you want to go? We also talked about the different structure a little bit, and we did talk about due diligence a bit, and hopefully you all have the email that was sent out today that has a due diligence checklist on it. We will talk about that as we as a thread as we go through, because due diligence is something that really relates to your individual circumstance and your type of organization and what you're looking for. It's also something, as we talked about the last meeting, the last session a lot, around you knowing who you are before you get into situations where you're negotiating or discussing or being transparent with another organization. So it's good as a readiness tool to do your own internal due diligence, your own internal self-assessment. So in this session, with that as a background, we're going to talk about what strategic restructuring is. We did that last time, but just to set the stage here, and the process in a bit more detail than we did last time in terms of the 4 phases of the process. And within that, how's due diligence and legal processes and negotiations kind of fit within that. And then we're going to start getting in nitty gritty, and Stephanie's going to really lead off on the confidentiality, the NDA, and if you get to the point where you're agreeing to negotiate with somebody, what that is and what it means. As you get into these discussions, you are sharing information. There is points of confidentiality. There is sensitivities around who knows what, and that's a critical issue. Virtually any discussion that you're going into and how you want to handle that. We're going to talk about the models, which we very briefly talked about last time. And we will get into some in-depth discussions around some of the more weighty or legal substantive models and what you need to do and what those processes are from dissolution to merger. We did last time just also touched on third parties. Given the backdrop that we're getting more deeper into the negotiations and putting the pieces together in restructuring and negotiating restructuring, we want to take another look at where the role of third parties are fitting into that process. And then just as a summary, a list of just quick tips from the last session to this session in simple terms of how to think about this, things to watch out for, how to prepare yourself. And we're going to go through a summary of all those. And hopefully we'll have time for question and answers. I do encourage folks to go into the chat and ask questions as we go ahead, as we move ahead throughout this, and we'll try to answer them within the context of the questions and the content. So if we're okay with that, we'll go ahead. So just as we talked about last time, there's lots of terms being thrown around, and you'll hear terms here. And sometimes some of them have very legal meanings. Some of them are very just popular. Some of them are very, people use terms to kind of soften what they may be doing with certain constituencies. And so there's, outside of the legal terms, which we'll be talking about, people can talk about restructuring, strategic alliances, strategic relationships, collaborations, consortiums. There's a lot of different words out there. So we're going to just settle on a working definition for our purposes on what we mean when we're talking about strategic restructuring as we're looking ahead here. And we're defining as an ongoing and binding relationship. That's a key piece. We're not just talking about a temporary referral relationship between organizations. We're talking about something that's ongoing, binding to the parties. And often when we talk about binding, as you look at these kinds of relationships, that's where people kind of get a little sticker shock. What are we obligated to do? There's a contract, there's agreements. So it's very different than any kind of informal relationship that you may have. So we're talking about ongoing and binding relationships between two or more organizations that involves investment on your part, and both parts, risk, and a change in control and culture. These relationships involve change, and it's not going to be that all the parties doing the same thing that they have been doing and they're just working together. There is going to be change, and we talked a lot last time about how to look at that change and your own self-assessment and how you are willing to engage in change. But you do that by merging, and we'll talk about those definitions: sharing relationships, sharing resources, transferring or combining services, resources, or programs. So the merging, sharing, transferring, or combining services, resources, or programs are what you do when you're getting into strategic restructuring, as we're going to be talking about those relationships. That really defines it in a different way than just simple, we're collaborating, we have a good relationship, we meet and greet, we share information, but are you really doing anything substantively? So as we look at the next slide, and we look at the processes, we talked about this kind of very briefly last time. And think about, if you're in these discussions or you're looking at moving forward to this, where are you in these four kind of categories? And we focused a lot last time on exploratory and readiness. Knowing your own motivations, your interests, understanding your situation fully, and how to cover your internal bases if you're going to get into any kind of negotiations, making sure that your board's on board, what you want to have your staff know, where are a key stakeholders, whether they're funders, donors, or regulatory organizations. Where are you in that situation? And before you get into discussions, have a good gauge on your environment and how ready you are. And do you know what you're interested in? Do you know what you're motivated for? We also talked about, which is the purpose of these sessions, particularly the first one, is understanding the options. Both you as staff or volunteers or board members, your key leaders, know what the options are, know the language, because the language can scare people. There's hot button issues. We talked about that. We'll hit that again. And there may be a lot of misnomers and myths about what those things mean or they don't mean. So we want to be clear about the language so that you don't have language interfere with your ability to move forward if you so desire. And last time we did talk about scanning potential partners and developing and implementing contact strategies for reaching out to them. Again, in readiness, understand that you can be ready, but when you're looking at a partner, are they ready? You may be in a more advanced stage, and they may have to go through and look at their own interests and motivations, and you may challenge them to do that before things get too far or too serious. So that was pretty well taken care of in the first session. This one, the second point here is when you start the contact and you have somebody who's willing to talk to you, you start generally informal discussions. You haven't signed anything. You just, maybe directors get together, maybe the executive committees get together to see if there's a there. And also to feel each other out on where they are at in terms of their situation coming into these kind of discussions. This stage kind of clarifies motivations. There's some discussions around process. You may have some light due diligence. You may sign an NDA at this point or at some point in the pre-negotiations if you're starting to share information. And that is often around proprietary information or information you may not feel is publicly available. And you kind of get a gauge on the side how educated you are about the options and the relevance and where everybody is. If you're going to move forward in any kind of serious negotiations, and particularly if you're talking about the mergers or kind of real shared services or anything along those lines that are going to be significant, you may negotiate. You generally prefer to negotiate, have a negotiating team, and that is going to be more so if there has a board involvement. If it's strictly a operational kind of thing of outsourcing fiscal and the board is aware of it, you might not need to involve your board too much outside of getting their consent. But there would be negotiations, who's doing that, and what's the formality around those negotiations. And we will be talking about, Stephanie will be talking about a negotiating agreement and some of the terms of that. And again, the substance of those things depends on what you're looking for and what your end goal here is and what your own circumstances. So these things are flexible depending on where you are and what you're looking at. And then you go into negotiations and doing that in good faith. There's due diligence, there's confidentiality, there's strategic communications that both sides need to make. You don't want one side saying one thing, telling their staff that you're moving in this direction. The other side hasn't told their staff yet. You got to really start operating as one in terms of the focus being you're negotiating. There has to be delegation. Obviously, not everybody can be sitting around the table of 30 people, board members and staff negotiating. So there has to be a delegation to a task force or a group to do that. And you got to think about what those outcomes are. And if those negotiations reach some agreement, how's it come back to each of the parties? Who makes what decisions? How much consensus there might be? What's the package? And generally, when you look at these things, if something requires a board vote, you do not want a 9-member board to vote 5-4 and expect that it's going to be successful at the end of the day, because it means there's lots of dissension and there'll be problems that will come back and bite you. So you're looking as much as possible to get consensus, if that's possible, within both parties, as well as supermajority. We'll talk about that a little later and on how those kinds of surprises can disrupt a well-organized process. And then all this is supposed to lead to putting it together, implementing it legally as well as operationally, and going through the transition and the post-solution. These negotiations and reaching this, there's a lot on the process because it really has to focus on the process and due diligence. But at the end of the day, it's whether or not you can make it work. And at the end of the day, you want it to work. And not all the time. You may come out and decide this is not a good relationship. This is not going to be for us. And that's a good sign. That can be a success of the negotiations if it's not in the cards. So you're always looking at, can you make this successful at the end of the day? And if you can't, then that's telling you this isn't going to work. It's okay. That's why you're going through due diligence. That's why you're going through negotiations. But we will talk a bit about particularly the tips around the transitions and the solutions of that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie in the next slide in terms of confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements, which, as you noted, can happen earlier rather than later in many cases. So,
Great.
Stephanie.
Thanks, Doug. And before I kind of dive in, I have to do my usual legal disclaimer, which I did not do in the first presentation because we were really talking very, very high level. We are going to get more into the weeds on specific legal requirements under Nebraska law and legal issues, and I'm happy to answer questions. But I do want to note that while I am an attorney and I do practice regularly in this area, I'm not necessarily your attorney. I do see some of the attendees, some of you, I actually am your attorney, but many of you not. And so I want to make sure that you know that I'm not giving you specific legal advice tailored to your specific organization. And I do encourage you to seek your own legal advice. If you're looking at entering into one of these kinds of transactions, they can involve a really relatively complicated layer of rules, both under state law and at the federal level. So do encourage you to get legal advice, and please don't consider what I say today to be legal advice directed to your organization. So with that, yeah, usually this is where the lawyer first enters into the environment. So I usually get a call from the client at the stage where they're going to be signing a confidentiality agreement, either asking me to provide one or to review one that has been proposed to them. That would be my recommendation, is that you do get an attorney involved at this early stage where you're first signing a confidentiality agreement. Part of the reason for that is I have seen organizations that just kind of find an NDA online, they Google it, and it's not necessarily appropriate for this type of a transaction. Some NDAs are mutual, where each organization is going to be sharing information with the other, so the obligations go both ways. That's usually most appropriate for these kinds of transactions. Sometimes they're unilateral. Sometimes NDAs are specific to individuals, and they're not actually they're not broad enough to be appropriate for kind of a merger transaction kind of process. So make sure that you're getting one that works for you, and if possible, ask an attorney to provide one or to review it. The basic features that are in a confidentiality agreement I've kind of outlined here. The real kind of heart of the agreement is how does it define information that is, quote, confidential. And you might think, well, this is just sort of boilerplate, but it's really not. You need to very closely review that definition and make sure that it fits your organization. And specifically, if you have like particularly highly sensitive information, you want to make sure that you clarify that that's covered. Sometimes you'll see a confidentiality agreement that says information is only confidential if it is stamped confidential. So that means you have to be, if that's the kind of agreement you have to be very careful when you're sharing information that you mark it as confidential. That would mean that no verbal information that's shared is confidential. I wouldn't recommend that. I wouldn't recommend, narrowly tailoring the definition to that extent. Another thing that you'll have to consider, sometimes the very fact that you're even having discussions itself is considered confidential. And that might be appropriate. It might be so sensitive that before you even start talking, you want to sign an NDA that says, hey, the fact that you and I are meeting right now and even having these preliminary talks, I don't want anybody to know about that. So those are the kinds of things that are included in the definition of what's confidential. You'll see in NDAs very common exceptions that you should be aware of to this definition of confidentiality. So if information is already out there in the public domain and anyone in the public can access it, it doesn't matter if someone tells you it's confidential or marks it as confidential, it's not going to be considered confidential. Likewise, if one of the parties receives that same information lawfully from someone who doesn't themselves owe a duty of confidentiality, it's not going to be considered confidential. And if a party already has possession of the information prior to disclosure as part of these discussions, it won't be considered confidential. And then the final exception that you usually see is sometimes a party, even if it is confidential, even if it meets all of the other requirements to be considered subject to confidentiality, if they are compelled by a court or an administrative agency to disclose that information, it will be excluded from their confidentiality obligations. Often we do have language in there that will say, okay, but first you have to give us as much advance notice as you can so that the party that disclosed that information and considers it confidential can take all the steps that they might want to try and stop that disclosure as part of a judicial proceeding. So once we've determined, okay, information is confidential, what does that mean for your organization when you receive that confidential information? It depends on what the NDA says, and there's a lot of variety out there, but usually it will say, you need to take reasonable safeguards to protect that information. And often the standard is the same type of safeguards that you use to protect your own confidential information. You need to limit access. So the agreement should specify who can you give this information to? Can you share it with all of your board members, all of your employees, or perhaps just a tight, a close group of people who have, quote, a need to know because they're actually actively involved in the negotiations? Sometimes an NDA will require that any individual that you provide the information to has to themselves sign an individual NDA. That's not as common, but we do see that sometimes when we're talking about really highly sensitive information. It will require that the party that receives the information use that information solely for the purpose of evaluating this potential transaction. And then often, if negotiations are terminated, if the deal does not happen, it will usually include a clause that requires that the receiving party destroy or return the information that they've received. It should also have a specific clause on what are the consequences of violating the confidentiality agreement. You'll often see language there that says it allows the disclosing party to use specific enforcement, which means that they can go and get an injunction, go to court, and while there might not be provable damages from the disclosure, they can have, quote, an equitable remedy. And then there sometimes will be language in there about the actual term of the NDA. Often we start with an NDA that just is a perpetual NDA, but sometimes it's appropriate to state in there a specific term that we believe this information will be confidential. So 2 years, 3 years. Sometimes the thought is, okay, well, at that point, the information is so kind of dated and stale that it's not considered confidential anymore. So you sometimes will see a duration of the confidentiality agreement. Okay, do we want to go on to the next slide? All right, and Doug, feel free to chime in here with your observations on these documents as well. This one, one of the key things I want to be clear about here is that it doesn't really matter what you call this document. You're going to see this kind of document, a lot of different titles. In our practice locally, we often refer to this as a, quote, letter of intent or a term sheet. But essentially what it is a document that is used early on in the negotiation process. It's typically mostly non-binding, but I'll talk about, there are a few provisions in there that are intended to be legally enforceable provisions. But generally, this is a non-binding document. It's used early on, and it's going to be subject to the parties later coming to an actual official agreement, a definitive agreement. But this is a document that is very useful to kind of focus the parties, make clear, what is our goal here? What are we trying to do? Who are the individuals that are going to be involved in the negotiations from each side? Doug refers to that as a task force, which I think is a really good framework. And confirms that they have the authority, that each one of their boards of directors have said, okay, yes, we have these 3 people are going to represent us, and they have the authority to negotiate. That does not mean they have the authority to enter into the final agreement. It means they have our approval to enter into these discussions. We're not wasting your time. We're taking this seriously, and you can count on them as our negotiation representatives. It usually doesn't have, sometimes it will have a confidentiality clause that is its own, standalone confidentiality if you haven't already signed an NDA. But usually what I do is just incorporate the NDA that has already been signed and verify that it's still valid and in effect, and it covers all of the discussions that we're going to have under this document. Often this document will have kind of a due diligence timeline. So it might say, hey, each party is going to, in good faith, negotiate and share information that is requested by the other party for a period of, say, 60 days, or it could be 90 days, or it could be a very short period, 30 days. And it will, essentially encourage each party to be reasonable and share information. That said, that's not a legally enforceable obligation, right? So if the other party, you feel like they're not sharing information for you, you don't have a legal claim against them. But you might say, you know what, this is not working out. I'm just going to terminate negotiations if you feel like they're not being forthright and sharing information. It might include a clause that says our negotiations are exclusive with each other. So it might say, during this 60-day due diligence period, you agree that you're discussing this potential transaction with my organization and with no one else. I don't want to, I don't want to find out that you're sort of shopping around to lots of different, buyers. I want to know that I have your attention for at least these 60 days. You're not going to be discussing a similar kind of transaction with another party, with one of my competitors, for example. Usually this document will include I should say this depends on where you are in the process. If you sign this very, very early on before you've really had much substantive discussion, it might not say much about what the in transaction is going to look like. But in my experience, usually we're far enough into those preliminary talks at this point that we pretty much know what the structure of this potential transaction might look like. So in this document, it might have a list of kind of the key terms that we've agreed upon already, or that we think, are going to end up in the final document, and what we think the structure might be. So it would say, hey, we're in negotiations to merge our organizations together. You might even know, kind of sort of what the key terms of that are. We're going to create a new board of directors where representatives from each body are going to be on this final board of directors. You might have already had some discussions about key liabilities and what's going to happen to those, what's going to happen to the employees, what changes you might want to see in the governing documents. So again, Doug mentioned this is a very flexible document. Sometimes we see that and sometimes we don't. Sometimes it's too early really to list any of those key terms. I think the benefit of getting those terms either into this document or into like a subsequent kind of non-binding term sheet before you have lawyers go draft the definitive documents, and that's where you really start paying the legal fees. It's a good idea to have at least an outline with the basic key terms. Okay, everybody agrees this is going to be a merger. This is, this is what we're doing with employees. This is what we're doing with our board, so that those sort of the really material deal killer kind of terms, like, hey, I'm not going to do this deal with you unless my organization is the survivor, for example. Those are kind of the, hey, I want to make sure I get that on paper, that is a key term before we go through with the final step of preparing the final agreement and getting approval from members and the board. Sometimes this document will have other kind of closing conditions, like this, this is all non-binding at this point, and the deal will not close unless X, Y, and Z happens. That can be things like you might need regulatory approval. If you're licensed by some body, sometimes you have to get that approval before you can do the transaction. It will have all of the corporate approvals, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides here, all of the things that have to happen under the Nebraska Nonprofit Corporation Act before you can close the transaction. And then it will often have kind of what is our target timeline. It might say, the parties agree we're going to negotiate, our due diligence period will be 60 days, and that this transaction is intended to close, by the end of the year or within 90 days or whatever your target timeline is. The most important, from a legal perspective, one of the most important things that this document needs to say is it enforceable, and what provisions are enforceable? Unfortunately, I've actually early in my career, I'm a corporate attorney. I pretty much work just with nonprofit organizations on compliance and transactions. I don't do litigation. But when I was a first-year associate, I helped out on a lawsuit that was based on a term sheet like this that did not make clear whether it was supposed to be binding or not. It was prepared, I literally like on a napkin between the parties at a preliminary meeting. And one of the parties walked away from the negotiations and the other one said, no, we have a deal. This was a contract. And it was a long drawn out lawsuit about whether this preliminary document constituted an enforceable contract under Nebraska law. So from my perspective, one of the most important things that this document needs to do is say, this is intended to be a non-binding preliminary document. It is subject to the negotiation and execution of a definitive binding agreement with perhaps some exceptions. For example, the exclusive negotiation period might be enforceable, where if you find out the party has agreed to negotiate exclusively with you, but they go off and talk to another party, you actually would have a legal claim against them, if that's important to you. The confidentiality provision, if it's in this document, that would be enforceable. But all of the key terms, the structure of the deal, the closing timeline, all of that is, hey, this is our best guess at what's going to be in the final documents, but none of this is binding. And if it doesn't work out and we want to walk away from each other, there is no legal claim that either party would have against the other. Doug, do you have anything to add to this, this slide, or any questions from the audience?
Yeah, a little bit on the confidentiality piece, because it's often not the formal information, not the documents that creates the problems. It's the informal conversations where you start, let's say two executive directors, we talked about last time, trust is a big issue, and trust is between people, and you're trying to get trust between corporations. And there's a lot of people involved in this decision making. You can have the management or executive director, you can have board leaders, you can have a task force, you can have the whole board. So you have to really tier who knows what. The whole board isn't going to know everything. And they have to be able to delegate that. But where things tend to fall apart is around the informal conversations where maybe two executive directors have a great relationship and they're talking quote unquote out of school about each other's board and where people are at, who's against it, or a funder. And they assume it's going to stay within them during this process, but the other one goes back and tells their board. Or as we talked about in terms of confidentiality agreement, that's between the corporations. And at what point does it need to be between the individuals involved or even between board members? Can you trust if you give a report to the board about the process of negotiations that every one of those board members are going to keep confidential and not go tell somebody else? So it's hard to contain information, and you really need to tier this. And maybe even, as you suggested, Stephanie, individual board members need to sign it because it's the corporation that's on the hook, but you got to have ethical conduct and everybody that is in the know. And once you're in these discussions, particularly within board, everybody wants to know everything, and everybody's buzzing to each other inside and outside and saying outside of the structure as well as in the staff. Those are the kind of things that kill process. It may not necessarily be the formal sharing of information that way. It's the politics within the organization, if you will, the politics with the funder. So you have to be very careful what you say, who's saying it, and there has to be a good degree of trust, including within your own organization on who you're involving when. That's the kind of stuff that people hear that somebody found. Now I got a great example where we had it was going to be a merger between a Catholic organization and a Methodist organization. And the Catholic organization, which was chaired by a nun, did not want to tell the bishop. Yeah, that they were even in early discussions. However, that nun told another nun in church one day that they were having these conversations. That nun went to the bishop and it destroyed everything. And I think she just felt that it was comfortable and it would be okay. But you really have to look at your own internal politics and your decision making and your trust and how can you even corral your own folks to be able to be structured. So the process here has to be structured, but everybody makes their own decisions. And also in that regard, as part of a task force agreement, no executive director or task force should be telling their board something that the other board isn't being told. You got to make sure everybody's on the same message, saying the same thing, and not deviating from that. Particularly as rumors and everything can go around, particularly in a smaller community. So that's what I had to add, Stephanie. I don't know any comments about that.
Yeah, great. No, I think that's really insightful.
So Stephanie used the word transaction. I know when I first got involved in this in the 80s in our organization, we had merged 3 times. Every time we went to a lawyer, they said the word transaction. And it was it goes back to the sticker shock of words. It's like, no, it's not just a buying something. It's not just an exchange. It's substantive. It's like a marriage. Is the marriage a transaction? But it's a good example of how words in this process, whether it's from the legal profession or the auditor or funders, can change a relationship. So the transaction is, from a legal perspective, is an exchange. It's a transaction. From your perspective, might mean mission, mean much more substantive, but it's a good, I know I had a sticker shock. It took me for a while to get used to the word, this being called a transaction. So when we looked at restructuring paths, and we talked about this last time, and some of these, as noted, we're going to get into in depth. There's concepts of fiscal sponsorship. If you're a corporation that doesn't have an exemption yet, or you're an unincorporated entity and you want to come under another corporate entity or come under their C3 for fiscal sponsorship, that's a restructuring path. That actually might lead to an absorption or merger or something else. But you are negotiating a relationship. There is a transaction that's occurring there. You're getting something, and maybe the other party, the sponsor, is getting something. And in many communities, I know I discourage folks from incorporating if they're not capable of actually managing that and knowing what they're getting into. And these relationships is a good way to start a strategic relationship around fiscal sponsorship and working out those relationships. Divested programs or contracts is a transaction, much more purely, that you're moving your programs over to somebody else, or you're moving a contract over to somebody else. It might not be that's the extent of the relationship. You're not necessarily sharing a whole lot, but there is a program that's going to be absorbed by another program, hopefully. And I'm involved with 2 of these projects right now, and they both want to move a program that they're losing a lot of money on. They made that decision once they didn't get the money. Well, we don't want to do it, but we know it's important in the community. Can we find somebody else to do it? And there's an adage here, you do this over mission and opportunity. You don't drain yourself as an organization or a program, then expect somebody else to come and pick it up after you've gotten the best out of it. But you can move programs to contracts. Shared services, we're going to get into in depth in a few minutes. Related entities, we're not going to talk to great in depth, but that is essentially if you have a support foundation or you have 2 or more corporations that are related from an auditing perspective, and there may be shared board members intentionally. There may be some shared membership, but not one controls the other. Control meaning one has majority of the board seats essentially, or the majority of the membership that votes for that board seats. And it's like a stock market kind of thing. If you own most of the stock of a corporation, then you control it essentially. In nonprofits, it's really about the board seats and who has control over who's appointed to board seats. And so you can have related entities, which might go into joint ventures and whatnot. We'll talk about that a little later. And then affiliation or subsidiaries. These are very popular. I assume they're popular in Nebraska as well, where one organization may retain identity and retain name and retain corporate status essentially, but they are affiliated in a subsidiary with another, meaning the other organization may have majority control, if not total control, over who sits on the board and the entity, but the corporate entity is still there. When we often get into mergers, this is something that can be done by bylaws, and you have a lot of control yourself with a lot of regulatory authority. You can make that relationship work at a governance level or a membership level if you have a membership, and then work out the operational piece as a transition piece to a merger. Because merger may take a longer time, these things can happen quickly if you negotiate it. And then Stephanie's going to talk in depth about asset transfer, purchase, dissolution, and the concept of merger. So I'm going to talk a bit about shared services now, which is popularly used. If we go to the next slide. Shared services, which is much more has the feel of transaction. You're buying services from each other and you're paying for it. Whatever the arrangements are, you're getting this and they're getting that. So it's a contractual transaction that has a contract or exchange of resources between nonprofits where costs are shared in some way, or one partner delivers products or services to another, maybe at cost, maybe below cost, or maybe they do it on a profit margin. It all depends on the circumstances. And it typically involves core common business functions. And the type of level of service depends on the level of trust between the organizations and the nature and intent of the relationship. Are you doing shared services because you're looking at this as a stepping stone to maybe something more serious if it works out? Or is it merely I'm outsourcing this to another nonprofit rather than to a for-profit like IT services? When there is a parent-subsidiary relationship between the corporations and between the boards, where one is controlling the other, there's always a shared services operational component to it. How much that is may all depend on the nature of the relationship. So if you look at this wheel, I mean, a lot of folks say, well, shared services is a good way to get into this because we may be doing some of the same things. We might be able to save some money. They have a competency and a skill and knowledge that we don't have. We might have something that they don't have, and we can share it, but we maintain our identity. We're not corporately affiliating. We're not merging. We're not changing our name. It's a business function or a program function that we're putting together because it's in our mutual interest. Typical, and areas are accounting, billing, and purchasing, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more depth. It could be an it could be, many times an organization has a interim executive, they may buy that service from another organization, or HR services, which is a backbone kind of service that some folks don't have, particularly small organizations. Easy space equipment, janitorial, ground services. Obviously, low-level fruit, not threatening. There's not a lot of proprietary information in there like there might be with HR or accounting. That's something that a lot of folks may dip their toes into to see how a relationship would work without a lot of risk. Obviously, programs and services is something you can share at that's mission related, but you're not necessarily sharing any financial information, donor information, or things along those lines, and just general administrative support kinds of activities. So there's a range here, but the way you look at this kind of goes back to confidentiality. How proprietary is the information? Can that information be used by whoever you're partnering with for perhaps their own purposes? And so if you share accounting services and fiscal services, obviously you're sharing salaries, you're sharing HR, you're sharing donors and donor lists, you're sharing your own, and you're at a heavy level. Organizations really only do that with each other. And we'll get into another model here, with each other only if there's a real high level trust there and you're probably merging with something else. It's same if you're doing on an ongoing basis, even fund development, but sharing administrative services, sharing copy machine services, sharing space services are kind of lighter stuff that folks do to save money and maybe have a partnership that could blossom into more intensive, more extensive kinds of shared services. So these agreements, it sounds simple to get into, but they're not necessarily, and you have to watch it. And I always advise, don't jump into it totally. Test the trust. If you, especially if you're not looking this as a path to go somewhere else, both parties intentionally to maybe have a more intensive relationship, but it is a business relationship to share costs or to sell services like you're outsourcing. Be clear that that's what that is. And you may also, we call it shared services if you're doing it between nonprofits, but you may have two organizations acquiring services from an IT company that's outsourced for profit, and they decide, hey, we could have a staff person. You could have the staff person, and we'll buy it from you. I'd rather do that than do a for profit. I'm on a village board, and we had a meeting last night with a school district who wanted to sell us and have shared services around websites. We're not changing anything. It's just a low-level kind of product outsourcing. And the decision is, do you want to buy it from them or do you want to buy it from somebody in the private sector? So think about this in terms of where you're going at, what you're intending to do, how much trust you have. Is there an intention for this to develop into something else or not? And what are you willing to share? And you need to have a contract, and that has to have confidentiality in here no matter what you do and the level of it. So I know, Stephanie, any comments on that?
No, I think I just, one kind of key distinction between this kind of what is really a contractual arrangement and the transactions, sorry, that is a very legal word we rely upon a lot, that I'm going to be speaking about in the next few slides, is that the ones that I'm really focused on are considered fundamental transactions under the Nebraska Nonprofit Corporation Act, which trigger kind of heightened requirements. A shared services model like this, in addition to the kind of general flexibility of it, one benefit of it is that it does not specifically trigger a bunch of requirements under the Nebraska Nonprofit Corporation Act, since it's just a contractual arrangement and each organization is retaining its own independence.
Yeah, the only perhaps outsourced regulatory is if you're doing it under a government contract.
Right.
And what you may be doing as money is coming into an in-staff position, then budget has to be amended and approved by the funding source that you're outsourcing this, particularly on personnel related costs. You're moving from personnel to outsource, and you just got to make sure you can go to those arrangements will work for you. So the next slide, if you look at shared service models, and this is just one way of looking at this, we really were talking about was an independent provider in one way, with one nonprofit, and the lowest level is just selling services to another. That nonprofit may have more than one client that they do. There are concerns about that in some cases, because what happens, a lot of cases, independent providers may say, okay, I have excess IT services available right now. And rather than taking a full-time person and cut them down to half-time, I want to sell it. And you need IT services, I can give you a good deal on that. That works up until the independent provider says, oh, gee, I need this person now full-time. And that may change the agreement that you have, but you got a contract. It is a contract. And a lot of times we think of these as we're cooperating, we're collaborating, that's good, but you are actually doing a contract that you're outsourcing, and parties need to be held to, are they producing what you need to produce? Whoever signs your check. Often staff think that's who my first obligation is and who I prioritize. So sometimes organizations get into this, and they're getting into it because they feel they have the staff capacity or the capacity to do it, but they're not intending it to hurt their organization. They want that to be the first client because that's their staff person. They're selling excess kind of capacity. So that's where these things kind of fall apart, or relationships can fall apart between two collaborating organizations over these kinds of contracts. So it's not as simple as it looks, because there's always context of the relationship. A shared service alliance is a way of thinking about, outside of I'm just organization A selling services to organization B who wants it. It's where a group of nonprofits come together to integrate or do some group purchasing. Or they may, like I say, you may have a common IT network provider that's working between the 3 or 4 organizations, and you put that together. It may be something that you do between each other, it may be something you go out and purchase in the marketplace from the for-profit sector, and you're collaborating as an alliance to make this work. A lot of small organizations outsource their bookkeeping, for example. And in many communities, they may use the same bookkeeper, but they're all working with them independently. And they could come together and say, we can get a better deal if we do this as a collaborative. We all intentionally collaborate, contract with that same bookkeeper, rather than each of us doing it individually, and we have less leverage. Those kinds of things you can do and be very creative about in a lot of different ways. But you're not necessarily contracting with each other in that case. A joint venture, and that's one of those words that has a lot of different meanings out there depending on what you're doing. But for the purposes of this, it's when those group of organizations that we're talking about, to shared service alliance, decide that they want to own in some way a common organizational vehicle to sell them back services. That often only works if you have scale, where if you're going to create another nonprofit, for example, and maybe a management support organization, or you could even create a for-profit if you felt you needed to, like a maintenance company or building maintenance for facilities. In many cases, it's an organization that people want to put their backroom services, that they want to put their IT, they want to put their billing services, Medicaid billing or other services in this. And they all feel in many cases that they just can't be competitive because they don't have the in-house expertise or resources to be able to put it together. But we all have the same need here. And if we combine our resources and we're paying for these services into our own corporation, that's like a co-op, if you will, that sells it back to us and we govern it, that's a way we work together. And you could do it any level of services there. Again, the difficulty is you're creating another entity. You have to support the other entity. That entity exists to support you in terms of services, but it has to be financially viable as well. And any contracts or any of those kinds of relationships, you really have to have a business plan. You really got to work out the numbers, and you got to work out the equity between a big organization joining and a small organization joining. They're increasingly common, but again, it's often when in healthcare or education or the larger Medicaid organizations will put these things together because there's a clear common interest that they have, and they're not looking to get too far into other kind of management or programs. And it keeps their program separate from the management and support. The shared services hub is a bit of the same thing. It could be owned, it could not be owned, but the issue about the hub is it's selling services to all kinds of folks, not just to the owners. And that's where these things, when you look at joint ventures and you moving to shared services hub, well, happen in a lot of joint venture organizations when they form these organizations, is they'll sell services to the members who own them at close to cost as possible. because the financial interest is to the participating buyer, if you will, the owner. And then they will often think, hey, you know, we could sell these services to other organizations and we can make money off of it to subsidize the services we're providing to our core members. So the business model starts shifting to where you're a hub of selling services out into the community. There may be a core group of organizations that are in your joint venture that benefit from it because they see that this is a service that's provided in the marketplace. There's a market for it and they can sell it, and they're not going to sell those services at the same price that they're selling it to the members. So there's a lot of different ways to work this out, but again, it's much more formal. There's corporate status here. There is regulatory status. You're moving in. There's even questions in some cases. The IRS questions whether just providing common management services is a charitable activity, even if it's a charitable organization. You start getting into those kinds of discussions on how to structure this in a way. And in my experience, you know, lawyers often work out other language that it does other things other than doing this to kind of shade that, or to be able to get it through the IRS so it can still stay as a C3. I know, Stephanie, if you had experience with these kinds of things.
Yeah, just one comment on that. You know, when lawyers work out that language, we do want to make sure that it is accurate, but you're correct. I mean, sometimes I work with Katie, who's on the line here, the associate in our group that does these a lot and files a lot of applications with the IRS. And we definitely try and articulate things in a way that we think will be framed in a positive light, in a way that will get through with the IRS, but want to make sure it's always accurate. Yeah, I think there's so many different ways that this can look, and I think Doug has done a great job of outlining some models of how this can be structured. I think the key thing from the legal perspective is, you know, obviously the contractual terms and all of that, but when you're getting to the step of creating a new entity, a whole layer of additional legal issues get involved, including the tax status, whether it's going to be tax exempt, what the, you know, corporate governance of it is going to look like. So certainly do get legal help with, particularly when you're getting into the type of model where a separate legal entity is being formed.
There's a lot of creativity that come in here, but it really is about business and the business models. And can you know, why are you doing it? How's the money going to flow? And then what's the structure? Form follows function in many cases, but you really got to make the money work because you're doing this as business transactions. You're doing it to save money or make money, not necessarily as a mission related entity. You're doing it for an operational integration and what might be best business wise for your organizations. So it is different. But you then get into as Stephanie's talking, you're forming corporations, you're talking about who has what ownership, how's the structure of that, who controls it, who's the executive leadership of the other corporation, and you're creating a whole nother layer. And my caution is that costs money. And it doesn't always save you money up front, particularly, as a lot of these kinds of structures do. So then we'll turn it back to Stephanie on asset transfer.
Yeah, so the next 3 slides are kind of a summary of legal requirements under Nebraska law for 3 types of, quote, transactions that Nebraska law views as fundamental and deserving of kind of heightened oversight and heightened approval. So before we dive into those specific Nebraska legal requirements, I do just kind of want to remind everybody, we talked about this in the first presentation, and Doug has alluded to this quite a bit, but what the distinction is between these 3 transactions. So we're talking first about asset transfers. Next, we'll talk about dissolutions, which are usually kind of step 2 when we do an asset transfer transaction. And then finally, we'll discuss mergers. So when I have a client come to me and say, hey, we're discussing with another organization, combining our 2 organizations. We have very similar missions. We think that for efficiency and scaling purposes, it would be best if we combine into one. Often the term they use is that they're going to do a merger. And I then will ask, a little bit more specifically about what they're talking about. Is it truly a quote merger under the Nebraska statute, because in my experience, the term merger can be used much more broadly than Nebraska law defines it to mean two organizations coming together in some manner. And usually in those kind of threshold discussions where I have with them, are we talking about an asset transfer or a merger? They haven't really thought often about the kind of nuance, the differences between those two transactions. So when we're talking about an asset transfer and we have two organizations that are going to combine their programs, we have two legal entities. After the transaction, there will still be two legal entities. So neither one of those entities is going to go away. What's going to happen is that all of the assets held in one of those entities are going to be literally transferred to the other, leaving an entity that is essentially a shell, but it still exists. It's still, if you looked at the Nebraska Secretary of State, you would still see that entity as an active nonprofit corporation. It does not automatically go away. It's still there. It still has a board of directors. It still has articles and bylaws. It just may not have any assets left. So the difference when you do a merger is that that organization doesn't just transfer its assets over. It literally is absorbed by the surviving organization, and there becomes one entity. The organization that is absorbed into the surviving entity goes away. So they're two very different transactions under Nebraska law. And we'll talk about why you might do one over the other. The main legal reason is that when you do a merger and two organizations combine into one, that the surviving organization acquires all of the assets and all of the liabilities and everything that the organization that goes away had, whether the surviving organization knows about those liabilities or not. So in my early discussions with a client, I often will ask, well, in your due diligence that you've done so far, have you discovered are there any skeletons in the closet? Are there legal problems here? Do they have potential litigation claims? Do they have unhappy former employees? Are there, potential regulatory problems? Have they been complying with all of their 501c3 requirements? Those kinds of issues those discussions we have early on. And if it turns out that there is a concern about liabilities, and I'm representing the organization that's going to be acquiring the other organization, sometimes I will recommend, well, let's look at doing an asset transfer. Because when you do an asset transfer, you can pick and choose the liabilities that you are going to expressly assume. The general rule when you do an asset transfer is that only the assets are being transferred unless the agreement specifically identifies and states that the acquirer is going to assume certain assets or certain liabilities, excuse me. So that's why we might look at this. Now, the downside of doing an asset transfer, usually from the client's perspective, is that it's usually more expensive from a legal perspective because it's not as simple. There are more documents usually that we have to prepare than when we do a merger. And the reason for that is that because when you do a merger, because the one organization just goes away and everything is assumed by the acquiring organization, the quote surviving organization, you don't have to list out all of those assets and all of those liabilities. It just happens automatically by operation of law. When you file the merger documents with the Secretary of State, it just immediately, all the assets and liabilities are owned by the surviving organization. That's not true for an asset transfer. When we're helping clients with an asset transfer, we want to see a list of the assets. We want to see all of the liabilities, and we need to actually identify those and have transfer documents that effectuate the transfer of those. So the other additional hurdle that we have to jump over when we do an asset transfer is listed here on the slide, which is Nebraska Attorney General notice. So you'll see here on this slide, I've in quotes, this is the statutory language that triggers all of these requirements under the Nebraska statute with respect to asset transfers. So it's if you sale, transfer, or otherwise dispose, which might be often by gift, quote, all or substantially all of an organization's property. When a client comes to me and says, we're combining our two organizations, we want to, get rid of everything, we're all going into one, there's no question whether this transfer statute is triggered. But sometimes we have clients that are just transferring a single program or a division of their organization. You know, we've determined this is not really consistent with our mission anymore, or for whatever reason, we don't want to engage in this one program part of our organization. We're going to transfer it to another organization where it makes more sense. This could even be a sale of a, you know, division or a program, even possibly to a for-profit entity. We certainly have had clients that have done that. So when that's the case, we have to do an analysis about whether the transfer of that program, the transfer of those specific assets, constitutes, quote, substantially all of the transferring organization's property. And there's no magic test for that. Unfortunately, under Nebraska law, it's not like, well, if it's over 51% of your total assets, you have to give notice. It's more of both a quantitative analysis, but also a qualitative analysis. And the key that courts look at when they look at this question of, are you transferring substantially all of your assets, is this really kind of one of the primary purposes of your organization? Once you transfer this program, are you going to essentially look the same, or are you going to be a completely different organization once you've gotten rid of this program? If it's close, and we've had clients where it's kind of close, we usually advise, let's consider this potentially a transfer of substantially all of your assets, and let's make sure that we're complying with all these requirements under the statute. So what are those requirements? Well, one is that you have to get specific board approval. Now, you need to get a board approval of all sorts of transactions and things that you do all the time, but usually the threshold for that approval is that you need to get a majority vote of the board at a meeting where you have quorum. If it is this type of a transaction under the statute, where it's a transfer of substantially all of your assets, you need a higher vote than that. You need to either get a majority of all directors in office or a 2/3 vote of those that attend the meeting and vote. You also need to give a heightened notice. So you need to give at least 7 days advance notice of the meeting, including specific notice of what you're going to be discussing, this asset transfer, and preferably a copy of the asset transfer agreement that they're going to be voting upon. Now, your own bylaws might have even higher thresholds than that, but that's the minimum under the Nebraska statute that you need to get. If your organization has members, if the transferring organization, has members, then you also have to go out to the members and get a vote. Now, let's just quickly talk about what it means to have members, because this is an issue of confusion that we see a lot. So there's a lot of nonprofit organizations that use the term members, and it might be a group of individuals who maybe pay dues, they get a newsletter, they might get certain kind of like VIP status at events. But the question is not whether you call them members. The question is, are they members as defined under the Nebraska Nonprofit Corporation Act? And the definition of member under the Act is, does that person have the right to vote on the board of directors? If they do, they're a member under Nebraska law, and you have to go out and get their approval in addition to board approval. The Nebraska statute has a lot of requirements regarding that approval, specific notice periods that you need to follow, specific language that needs to be in the solicitation, where you're asking them to send back a ballot or you're asking them to sign a consent. So there's a lot of requirements there. In most cases, this does not apply. Most nonprofit organizations do not have members, but we have worked on transactions in the past where the transferring organization did not realize they had members until we looked at their governing documents. So we look at their bylaws, we look at their articles of incorporation, and their articles say they have members, and their bylaws say they have members that are supposed to be voting on the board of directors. And this has added a hurdle and extended the timeline on transactions we've worked on in the past, where the transferring organization really had not been complying with those bylaws, but as it turns out, they did have members. Sometimes you'll even see the bylaws will say, anyone that's made a donation to the organization is a member that is supposed to vote on the board of directors. Well, that can be, a huge group of individuals and folks that you might have a difficulty getting a response back from them, getting them to attend a meeting or getting them to return a ballot. So if you have, I would encourage you early on in the process to have an attorney review your governing documents, confirm whether you have members or not, if there's any question about it.
Yeah, Stephanie, just adding on that, because I come across the same situation that's often neglected. And so the members don't even know they're members. So there's a whole educational piece on that. And then you have to fix maybe even it even gets into where the board has been duly elected to make these decisions because they haven't had a membership vote in 10 years or whatever that is. But the other piece, when you start talking about this, you now have to reach out to the public, which is the members, about what you're doing. And if they haven't been involved and all of a sudden they have an interest, I'm against this or something, you create a whole nother political situation for your organization that you can't necessarily contain. So if you say, everybody that comes into literacy volunteer and receives service is a member, or every donor is a member, there's a whole nother thing you have to do now. Not only to get them engaged and have them understand what they're doing and blah, 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 but they now have to sell the idea of the asset transfer to them. And it can be a mess. So this goes back to knowing thyself and fixing those things before you get too far in these processes.
Yeah, if we talked in the first presentation about, you might not really be at the stage where you've identified someone that you're going to be merging or combining with, but it might be something that you're doing in the future. So you might go ahead and start doing some of this diligence, right? Reviewing your governing documents, making sure you have all of your ducks in order, and you might identify this as a problem before you get to the stage where you actually need member approval for a merger or an asset transfer. But you might just want to kind of clean up some of this stuff. So we've certainly had clients, because by the way, you also can't amend your bylaws without member approval if you have members. So often that's where this issue arises in our practice, is we're trying to make changes to the articles or bylaws, and they have to go out and they have to get member approval to change the governing documents to get rid of the members. Kind of a, sort of a circular issue, but yeah, and then it can be uncomfortable to then give notice to a group of individuals in the public who have never been asked to come to a meeting, have never been asked to vote on the board, even though they were supposed to be, and kind of explain to them, well, we're doing some cleanup and we think we need your approval for this. So, but the key point there is, I think, try and identify this issue early on if it is an issue for you, and clean it up before you get to the stage where you're actually approving final documents. And the third requirement that's outlined on this slide, which is also a significant requirement that comes as a surprise sometimes to our clients, is that before you can transfer substantially all of your assets, you do have to give specific written notice to the Nebraska Attorney General. Now, that's assuming that you are a, quote, public benefit corporation or a religious corporation under Nebraska law. If you're a 501c3, you are a public benefit corporation. So if you're a 501c3 organization, which probably most of you are, before you are the transferring organization transferring your assets, you have to give this notice to the Nebraska Attorney General. The notice has to be given at least 20 days before you transfer the assets. So when you're thinking about what that closing date might look like, when we're going to actually finalize all of this and actually effectuate the transfer, make sure you're giving yourself plenty of time to get this notice prepared and sent. And it's not an easy notice. It's not just a one-page letter that says, hey, Attorney General, we're going to do this transaction. You have to give them a lot of information, a copy of, and again, this is just the transferring organization. So often I'm representing the acquiring organization, and the transferring organization hopefully has their own attorney that's going to help them with this. But if not, it's really the acquiring organization wants to make sure that the transferring organization is complying with this requirement. But you'll have to include a current copy of the articles of incorporation, the current bylaws, a list of current directors, a copy of the board resolutions approving the transaction, and also member approval, if applicable. You need to give evidence of that. Evidence that you complied with the notice requirement under your bylaws and also Nebraska law. Documentation of the vote, which might be a copy of the minutes from the meeting, a copy of the definitive agreement. So this might be either, if there's a purchase price involved, it would be a copy of the purchase agreement, or a copy of the gift agreement, the asset transfer agreement, whatever you title that. That's the final binding definitive agreement. So it's not that preliminary agreement to negotiate we talked about earlier. This is the final binding agreement that effectuates the transaction. If there is a purchase price, and sometimes there is, it's certainly in our practice, we have seen relatively frequently nonprofit organizations that actually do sell assets. You have to provide the Attorney General evidence that the purchase price for that was, quote, fair value, and that there were no conflicts of interest. Or if there were conflicts of interest, you complied with the conflict of interest requirements under Nebraska law and under your conflict of interest policy, if applicable. So just putting this notice together requires quite a bit of work. So don't, make sure this is on your checklist of things that have to be done before you complete the asset transfer. This is one of, while we talked about the benefits of doing an asset transfer to the acquirer is that you're not assuming liabilities generally that you don't know about. But one of the downsides is this Attorney General notice, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, does not apply if you're doing a merger. Any questions, or Doug, do you have anything to add to that before we move on to the next slide?
Just quickly for the transfer, the board of directors is going to be on the hook for liabilities. The corporation is going to be, so they really need to make sure they're willing to assume that responsibility. And the liabilities could be future liabilities that you don't know about, right? If an employee comes from 2 years from now and sues for wrongful termination against the corporation, would that corporation still be liable?
Yeah, so good question. There is some nuance here. I will say, as a general matter, because when Doug said board directors are going to be on the hook, some of you might have sort of panicked.
Make sure you got D&O.
Yeah, as a general matter, members of the board of directors are not generally responsible for the liabilities and the obligations of the organization. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be named in a lawsuit, and there are exceptions to that if, depending on what the type of liability is and whether there, was negligence or gross negligence in the decision making at the board level. But there's not a hard and fast rule that all board members are responsible for the organization's liabilities. That said, you definitely want directors and officers liability insurance, because a plaintiff filing a lawsuit can name directors and officers as defendants, and you'll have costs at least to defend yourself, even if ultimately you prevail. There are protections also under Nebraska law protecting voluntary board members of nonprofit organizations. So generally, voluntary board members have statutory immunity from personal liability, so long as, again, they are complying with the general standards of care, their fiduciary duties as a nonprofit board member. Now, having said that, so when you do the asset transfer, one of the benefits is that the acquiring organization does not automatically assume all of the liabilities. When we talk about merger in a couple of slides, hugely important for the acquiring organization to do very, very good due diligence, because whether you find out about a liability or not, whether you have actual knowledge of it, the acquiring organization, by operation of law, automatically assumes all liabilities. When you do the asset transfer, your asset transfer agreement is going to say, we're acquiring, substantially all of the assets. It maybe even will include a list of what those assets are. It is usually going to say, we are assuming none of your liabilities except those specifically listed. So in my experience, often it is negotiated. A lot of times the transferring organization does have liabilities, particularly if this is a kind of financially distressed situation where the acquiring organization is kind of saving an organization that is struggling. There may be liabilities that the acquiring organization does agree to assume. Okay, we agree at closing, we're going to pay off this loan of yours, but that's a liability that's on your balance sheet that we know about. We're not assuming other liabilities. So Doug's example was, a year after the closing, a former employee brings a claim. So they maybe bring a claim for discrimination or harassment or something. Is the acquiring organization responsible for that? Generally, no. But if you're that employee and you're looking at, well, who do I bring a claim against? It doesn't mean they won't try to sue the acquiring organization, even though that was not an assumed liability in the asset transfer agreement. The more common problem I have seen is where not a litigation kind of claim where an employee brings the claim, but let's say the acquiring organization has vendors that it didn't pay and didn't tell the acquiring organization. Well, so then those vendors start sending invoices to the acquirer. Then the acquiring organization has the issue of, well, technically we didn't assume these liabilities because they didn't tell us about them. You know, this is a contract we didn't know about. We didn't know we were going to be assuming this expense. But you might have a PR or just kind of ongoing operation problem if you tell those vendors, sorry, we did an asset transfer and we didn't assume those. So you might still have practical issues of needing to pay off liabilities of the transferring organization. But from a legal perspective, you would have a pretty good defense against liabilities that are not expressly assumed in the asset transfer agreement. Now, one issue kind of related to this is what happens to that kind of shell organization that has transferred all of its assets. It still retains those liabilities, right? But it doesn't have any assets to pay them. It's just sitting there as a shell organization. What do you do with that organization? If I'm representing the acquiring organization, we often will require in the asset transfer agreement that that organization stay in existence for a certain period of time, which might be the full statute of limitations for claims that we're concerned about. And we often require that they continue to maintain liability insurance for potential claims that might be made after closing. That can help to alleviate potentially post-closing claims that the acquiring organization doesn't want to deal with. So let's go on the topic of dissolution. Let's go to the next slide now. This is a separate area of the Nebraska Nonprofit Corporation Act. Anytime that a 501c3 nonprofit corporation dissolves in Nebraska, there are these other specific requirements that you need to follow. Often a dissolution might be done in connection with an asset transfer. So some of these requirements can be, for example, you might be able to give the Nebraska Attorney General notice, hey, we're dissolving and we're transferring all of our assets to this organization in one notice. But in my example, where the acquiring organization says, hey, we want you to stay in existence as a separate legal entity for 3 years, for example, there could be various tail periods there. This dissolution paperwork wouldn't be filed for quite a long time. So these would be considered 2 separate transactions. First, the transfer of assets, and then later, a dissolution of that remaining legal entity. So these are the general requirements under Nebraska law. Anytime you dissolve an organization, and by the way, unfortunately, we have some clients who come to us and they have not found an organization to combine with or merge with or take over all of their programs. They are dissolving and they're going to liquidate. These requirements would also apply to that type of a dissolution where you haven't found somebody to take over your programs. You're just going to go out of business, essentially. If you're going to do a voluntary dissolution, which is what we recommend generally, these are all the requirements that you would need to follow. And I say if you're going to do a voluntary dissolution because the other alternative that sometimes organizations either affirmatively choose or just kind of happens by default is that an organization is, quote, administratively dissolved. Which essentially means they just stop filing their biannual report with the Nebraska Secretary of State. They become inactive. They are, no longer have active status with the Nebraska Secretary of State, and they are, quote, administratively dissolved. But that's generally not the procedure that we would recommend if you're going to go through a thoughtful dissolution. So what are the requirements for a nonprofit corporation that's dissolving? You need to prepare a plan of dissolution. Same kind of heightened board approval requirements for that. So, advance written notice of the meeting, a heightened vote threshold. If you have members, you do need to get member approval. You do have to give advance written notice to Nebraska Attorney General. So it's the same kind of documents that you had to give for the asset transfer, copies of your governing documents, copies of the board meeting where you had this approved, copies of the notice of that meeting. You also need to let the Attorney General know in that notice, where are your assets going to go? So when we have clients that are have transferred their assets to one organization that's taking over their programs, hopefully that's what's happening. Then you just tell them this one organization, which has a similar mission to ours, is going to be taking over our assets. We're going to be transferring it there. When we have an organization that is liquidating and no specific organization is taking over programs, they often will list perhaps several organization that, you know, once they sell off everything they have and pay all of their liabilities, if there's anything remaining, these are the organizations we're going to transfer remaining funds to. That you do need to file articles of dissolution with the Secretary of State and publish notice of the dissolution in a newspaper telling the public, hey, we have dissolved, we no longer exist. There's also provisions in the statute. These are optional, but we usually recommend that dissolving corporations follow through with these to provide written notice to both known and unknown creditors. So known creditors, you would actually, you know, send them a letter, tell them I'm dissolving. Sometimes the organization doesn't have enough assets left to pay them all in full. So then there might be a negotiation with those creditors about taking, you know, pennies on the dollar for what they're owed. And then also the notice to unknown creditors is published in a newspaper, again, a notice to the public in case there's any creditors out there that you don't know about. These are, again, optional. We recommend them because the benefit is that they will, after a certain period of time, they will bar claims. If, you know, if you give the known creditors notice that you're dissolving and say, hey, you have a certain period of time, I think it's 120 days, or don't quote me on that. There's a specific period of time where they have to give a specific written notice if they want to still make a claim. And if they don't, then their claim is barred. And then the final step after you've done, you know, you've given notice to the Attorney General, you filed articles of dissolution, you actually transfer the assets pursuant to the plan. So that might be a liquidation scenario, or it could be transferring it to the one organization that's taking over the programs, and then a final written notice to the Attorney General. So 2 notices to the Attorney General, the one telling them the plan up front, and then the one after you're finished with the final transfer of assets. Any questions on that? Okay, if not, let's move to the merger slide. So I've already talked quite a bit about the difference between the asset transfer and a merger. These are the statutory requirements for when you're going to do a merger. You have to do a written plan of merger. These are the key terms you're going to include in there. Who is the surviving entity? What are the terms and conditions of the merger? What amendments might you make to the articles or bylaws? And then if there are members of one of the organizations, how that's going to convert into memberships of the surviving entity. You do need to get, again, heightened notice and a heightened vote of the board of directors. And if there are members, both organizations have to get approval of the members to do a merger. Question here, do you have to give notice to the Nebraska Attorney General? No, generally not. If we're talking about 2 501c3s merging with each other, there is no notice required to the Nebraska Attorney General, which is one benefit of the merger structure. You'll then file articles of merger with the Nebraska Secretary of State and publish notice in a newspaper that you have done the merger. So again, it's a little bit a little simpler process and generally results in lower legal fees generally. So that is one of the benefits of doing the merger, particularly if the organizations don't have liabilities that are an issue. Anything to add on that, Doug?
No, just that, you know, if you have 2 membership organizations merging, that can get quite complicated. Because there's due structures, there's memberships. You got a whole nother body outside of the board of directors, 2 bodies that you have to negotiate with. Again, information becomes very public.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we only have a few minutes, and I'll quickly go through these. And I know Abby will send out the PowerPoint to everybody as a follow-up. We talked about this last time, and hopefully, as you kind of really learn more about the process in depth, you think about what facilitation you may need when obviously attorneys need to be involved, and sometimes earlier rather than later to make sure things are set up and you don't get yourself into a situation and then has to be fixed. There's accountants and the auditors that may be involved in this process. IT is one of the operational issues you often look at doing. There's fundraising and business models, experts and program models that you may be involved that when you're looking at what the final end product would be of these discussions, it's going to come down to mission and what will that look like. And as mentioned, vendors have a vested interest in this. Everybody from your liability insurance to business to these supplies, to to facilities. So think about what you might need for resources, when you might need to involve these folks in the process as part of the strategic conversation. I'm going to quickly just go through, Abby, if you can go through the slides on the tips, and I'll do this quickly, but give you a flavor of it. So next slide. We talked a lot. You got to know thyself. The more you're aware and self-aware of the pluses, minuses, motivations, your strengths, your weaknesses strategically, and liabilities and assets going into these conversations, the more it's going to go. And then again, for these tips, apply them to the other party as well. Next slide, please. Hot button words, we talked about that. I'll add transactions here to this list. But these things can make a big difference when you're trying to woo people over to what you're trying to do and what it is. And they need to understand that you may use a word like merger, as Stephanie was saying, to describe something that's not a merger because it kind of feels better and is easier to say. And some people avoid the M word totally because they don't want the reaction. So hot button words is something to be educated about and be prepared for. Next tip. 3 or more is a crowd. It's hard enough to do this with 2 organizations, much less 3, 4, 5. Now, including the shared services collaborative, there's more. But often when there's more than 2, probably the one organization that's the weakest link of wanting to do this or has the most internal issues can sink the whole deal for everybody. So organizations often, if you're talking about a merger particularly, will build who's the most easiest, friendliest, how can we make this work? And then you build a model, and then you look at other organizations coming in without renegotiating everything that you already negotiated. Next step, please. If there's executive transition, that's an opportunity. And keep your eyes out for that. And even from we talked about this last time, succession planning for executives may be an opportunity to look at collaborations or mergers or shared executive services as a start to these relationships. Next, please. You want to negotiate from strength, not weakness. We emphasize that. If you are certain things are important to you, whether it's legacy programming or board seats or name, don't go into these negotiations and you really don't have any leverage. This is started a problem of organizations not willing to really wanting to do this early enough, and they don't see that light at the end of the tunnel, and they go down and they don't have assets, and they're going into now a situation that there's not a lot of negotiations to occur. They're being acquired or it's an asset transfer. Tip 6, you have to be willing to delegate. Boards have to be willing to trust some folks to negotiate the details on this and come back to them when appropriate. And if you don't have an organization that has a culture of delegating and everybody wants to be involved, it's going to be very difficult to make negotiations, or I would even argue the confidentiality of these situations to work. Next tip. Oh, confidentiality, we emphasize that. It's no matter what all the sense is, no matter what, if the due diligence looks good and everything else, you're dealing with people trying to make a decision. There are folks that will have their own stake and special interests. You have to control communications, and not only do you have to do it as an individual organization, but you have to do it with your partner at the same time. So this is where culture starts coming together during these processes. Next tip. Financial risks. We've talked a lot about that. You got to manage it. You got to know it, and you got to manage it, both what you have going into it and what will come out at the other end. Next tip. Expect the unexpected. I'll tell you, this situation happens more times most of the ones that fail that I've been processed, something happened that wasn't expected. The board president left, the executive director changed. There was a piece of information that came out that nobody knew about, and it tips the whole situation. Again, it may not be the most rational reason, but things happen. In a lot of cases in mergers, it's about people. And if your core champions with either organization end up leaving, or there's some unexpected issues or change of leadership in an organization, it can throw this entire process off. So you have to think about that. Tip 11. It costs money, it costs resources. It doesn't work as easy as business works, where you just think, okay, we're going to come together, we're going to cut staff, and we're going to achieve, and we're going to get savings out of this. Generally, you don't do that up front. This takes investment. It takes risk investment. There may be savings if you're looking for savings, but it's probably likely to come down the road for what the costs are to be able to put this together. Tip 12. You got to test the trust. This whole process is testing the trust. We talked about, do you have trust going into it? But the whole process here to come out successfully at the end of the day with what parties want, you're earning trust and you're testing trust throughout the whole process. The legal agreements are one thing, but you never want to go there where you got to hold somebody to a binding agreement and you don't want to go there. So you really are testing trust and trust internally to your organization as well in terms of the people involved, and confidentiality is a sense of trust. Next tip. You know you're successful in these processes when all of a sudden the language changes and people are starting to talk about us together solving this, because it often starts out sides, we and them, and you're getting into it, and the attorneys can play a role in that process. But once you see the language starts changing, and then you know we're jointly trying to make this work, and we're working as a team to make this work, as opposed to we're negotiating what we want to do and whether we want to do it. I will also say if you do this in physical settings, where people sit is important. It starts off, people sit separated. As things go on successfully, all of a sudden there's a social relationship and people start moving around. That is success to a process. Next tip. Funders, bringing them along strategically. Another thing of knowing where people are, how are funders involved with this? Have people communicated with funders? Are funders keeping information confidential that they know this? Are funders playing a heavy role in making this happen? Are funders against it? And that's something both sides need to talk about, and right in the early going, have very good strategic discussions about your external stakeholders, which is funders or major donors often can come out of nowheres and wreck a situation because they haven't been cultivated to this kind of a solution or what you're doing. Next tip, please. You can't micromanage the solution. There's a lot of big picture issues here that are occurring within, as Stephanie talked about, within negotiations and everything. Don't get the board into micromanage. There's a point where if you're going to merge, and take that as an example, you hand it over to management. Don't try to micromanage in every kind of detail of this secretary's got to stay and this person needs to do this. And you got to be able to allow the organization to be an organization together and to deal with its business realities and its mission realities as it does. And the next leadership is going to be a different board, maybe on a merger particularly. There might be different management. You got to be able to hand that off. You're setting the bigger picture in the platform, taking care of the bigger liability and decision-making issues, but don't expect this to produce a detailed business plan and detailed staffing plan, and you're not giving the next executive director and the next combined board in a merger particularly the room to be able to move because you're contractually bounded. So that's a major point. Next step, making the deal is not the end game. Now, you've talked about that earlier. Implementation is about whether it works. Sometimes we just look at, well, we just got to get the organization squished. We just got to get this relationship and we'll figure it out later. It's about whether it works, and it's about the outcome at the end of the day. So you're always thinking that way. And you want it to take root. So you're building something new in many cases here. And you got to think of it that way, give folks the freedom in the next generation of leadership and those folks to be able to do it. But understand you're setting the stage for success. You're just not putting organizations together and squishing it and then figuring out later what you're going to do. Okay, I think we're out of time. I don't know if we have any questions, but I want to offer our thanks on behalf of Stephanie. Stephanie did a great job untangling a lot of tangled legal work and the
Thanks, Megan.
consequences of what you do.
Thanks for leading this. I hope it was helpful to the audience. And if there are questions, after the fact, feel free to funnel those through Anne and we can try and answer them.
Anne, you're on mute.
You would think after 4 years, I would learn not to do that at least once a day. Thank you very much, Doug and Stephanie. It was really interesting, incredibly helpful information as we see the changes that are going on in the Nebraska nonprofit community right now. So everyone joining me in thanking Doug and Stephanie, round of applause, and we will see you all in May. Have a good day. We are adjourned.